Right, welcome live from our studios in Auckland Park, Johannesburg. Thank you for tuning in. Today we celebrate 1 year on air with you, fulfilling our country duty. Perhaps thank you to all of you for your support. Feel free to send us some cake and chocolates if you can. But it really has been an absolute pleasure serving alongside you all, and we're certainly looking forward to many, many more milestones ahead. You're watching The Week Ahead. You can interact with us on our various social media platforms at The Week Ahead or hashtag The Week Ahead. But for now, I'm your host, Liesl Wilson. Let's take a look at some of those headlines for today. On a serious note, one person has died in a fire that gutted an informal settlement at KwaMai in Johannesburg. The NICD has confirmed 975 new COVID-19 cases in the country in its latest reporting cycle. And further afield, the Ukraine appeals for swift delivery of more weapons in the battle against Russian forces. All right, well, starting off with one of our top stories, the mental health care system in South Africa needs to be completely transformed to make it more accessible to the youth to adequately fight mental health issues. This was heard during the 7th Tsietsi Mashinini Memorial Lecture held at the Morris Isaacson High School in Soweto just yesterday.
It was through the gates of this school that Mashinini led a group of students out to protest against the use of Afrikaans in schools. And 4 decades later, the struggle continues, but it has taken a form of depression and unemployment amongst the youth.
Every young person, I wish to contribute towards groceries. I wish to take my parents out to a restaurant once in a while. I wish I could buy myself a few things without hearing.
But many who are unable to face that dark reality find an escape in alcohol and drugs. A challenge some medical specialists say require a scaling up of existing mental health support amid growing numbers of suicides.
Suicide is a growing public health concern. Official statistics in South Africa suggest that the prevalence of suicide is 14 per 100,000 people in the population. In the South African Stress and Health Study, which collected data between January 2002 and June 2004, the estimated lifetime prevalence rate of suicidal ideation was 9%. Suicide plans was 4%, and attempts was 3%. Women reported twice as many attempts as men. All mental illness and disorders were significant risk factors for lifetime suicide attempt, and substance abuse heightened suicide attempt risk.
Marukhanye says it's imperative to provide mental health support once the signs are noticed amongst those who have difficulties with coping abilities. Mulimo Nemoto, SABC News, Soweto.
Well, staying with Youth Month, as the country moves to celebrate National Youth Day under the theme The Year of Charlotte Manya Makleke, growing youth employment for an inclusive and transformed society. The focus will be around various youth development and empowerment initiatives to support young people. We now bring a special focus on youth in the legal society, but for a look at eradicating barriers to entry in the profession for young lawyers at large. We're going to be joined by Advocate Tembeka Ncukaitobi for this discussion. A very good afternoon to you, Advocate. Thank you very much for joining us here on the SABC.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here.
Well, it's a big day for us. It's 1 year since we started, so we're looking forward to having conversations, but perhaps also looking at ways to implement what we chat about. And context is key. Obviously, as we look at the legal fraternity, perhaps from 1994, what has been the current landscape of the legal society at large and attempts of transformation 28 years into democracy?
Thank you. Firstly, congratulations for your 1 year anniversary or 1 year birthday of your show, which has been moving in leaps and bounds. So very well done to you.
Thank you.
So just to come back then to the issue, I mean, the context of the conversation is that on the 18th of June, I've been invited by the Black Lawyers Association to speak to their quote unquote young lawyers about barriers to entry in the profession and the challenges that young lawyers face in entering, staying, and making a success of their time in the profession. Now, you have to understand the structure of the legal profession, divided between attorneys and advocates on the practitioner side. And then from the other segments, various legal professionals do various things. Some of them are in government working as legal advisors, others working in the state attorney, others are in the private sector working as legal advisors, others are in the mainstream of the economy, others work for parliament, and other legal practitioners work as judges. So the context of the conversation focuses pretty much on the category that is represented by the Black Lawyers Association, which is primarily advocates and attorneys. So when we ask the question, what are the barriers to entry and what are the difficulties experienced by young attorneys, primarily those who are younger than the age of 35? So that's the smaller category of persons that we are looking at. So unfortunately, the challenges to entry have not changed in the last 28 years. One, finding articles is still a struggle for many, particularly Black young lawyers. There are very few law firms that are willing to offer articles of clerkship. Finding pupillage may not be as difficult, but the problem is that pupillage is still primarily unpaid. And so you are looking at between 9 to 12 months of no income. Even if you do get articles, the pay is usually very low. And also finding quality legal work is a challenge for young lawyers. So although they see big high-profile cases being argued on television, when you actually start in practice, you simply do not have the chance to have access to that type of complicated legal work, which is probably the attraction to many young lawyers to try out law. And then there is also a generic problem that young Black lawyers also have to support families. They have to support uncles, aunts, fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, which is what is generally referred to as the Black tax. But they do so on the back of very, very low wages. And so those challenges persist, and it's my intention when I speak to the BLA to start by fleshing out those challenges, but also to point out that those challenges are unique to Black practitioners and sometimes even more pronounced to Black women practitioners.
Well, speaking of which, I actually just want to reference your book quickly before we get back into the discussion, because in The Land Is Ours, you write about, the African claims. It's a document that was in response to the Atlantic Charter with new normative principles to underpin and imagine South Africa that belongs to all. Obviously, we saw a group of intellectuals, including South Africa's first Black lawyers, attending to this, and they basically formed the Bill of Rights, negating colonial violence. I'm referencing this because you can't transform the legal profession without observing broader societal issues. And obviously, these involve issues of patriarchy and white supremacy, which you've alluded to now with some of the issues that females face and Black professionals. So my question to you is, why is the legal profession requiring such transformation at this point, given the structural impediments in every profession in South Africa to date?
Yes, thank you for referring to the Land Is Ours. Of course, the context in which the first generation of lawyers practiced, which was the early 20th century, is vastly different to the context that we practice now.
Yeah.
At that point, South Africa was a colony of the British, and it was gradually moving towards the consolidation of racial supremacy, at the heart of which was the Afrikaner race. And even though they were the British colonies and the Afrikaner nationalism was in its zenith, there was still then a group of young Black legal practitioners that still attempted to make a living. They got into the profession, they were opposed. I mean, if you look at the very first Black attorney who applied for admission to be an attorney in the Transvaal, Alfred Mangena. The Law Society actually opposed Alfred Mangena's application on the grounds that they did not want to encourage litigation among the natives, and admitting a black practitioner would encourage litigation among the natives. But even despite that opposition, the High Court itself admitted, the Supreme Court at the time, admitted Alfred Mangena and allowed him to continue practicing as a lawyer. But if you follow the trajectory of his life subsequent to the admission as a lawyer, he experienced gross racial discrimination, and he experienced absence of work, and he was subsequently targeted by the Law Society at the time for investigation. And ultimately, he was struck from the role of attorneys. And when he died, he was no longer a lawyer. He had, in fact, become a cattle dipper down in the Eastern Cape. Yeah. Now, that trajectory was similar, if not the same, to people like Pixlika Izaka Seme, who also were doggedly followed and pursued by the Law Society, which was largely informed by the racial ethos of the time. In today's context, this landscape has vastly changed, but some of the challenges continue. We no longer have to deal with naked racism. Racism comes in very subtle and invisible forms, but nevertheless, its impact is probably as serious, if not as severe. So the legal profession needs to come out of the shadow of its racist past in order to reclaim its space in the current South Africa. Doing so means dismantling the racist paradigm on which the legal system is built. And also it means dismantling the patriarchal systems in which the legal system is built. Throughout history, women practitioners have been viewed with a little bit of suspicion. The first woman practitioner who tried to get into the profession was viewed with derision. In fact, the court opposed the application of Schliessler, who tried to become an attorney in 1912. There was a judgment that said women were not qualified to become attorneys because they were not emotionally disposed to the profession and the rigors of the profession. And that kind of sexism, actually, which underpinned the legal profession for decades, some of which is still residually visible even today. So two big challenges that the profession must address. The one is the ongoing, subtle, invisible, yet significant racism. And on the other is the ongoing, sometimes not so subtle, forms of sexism as the two main challenges to be confronted.
Well, compounded with those issues then, I mean, we can't ignore the psychosocial factors that also come to the fore. And I wonder, you know, for the legal practitioners, I mean, what supports on offer to cater to the mental health of legal practitioners? I'm particularly looking at millennials and Gen Z. This is perhaps to create a more conducive environment for optimal performance, given the pressures of the field.
Yes, and often most legal practitioners that probably got admitted in the 70s and the 80s, they wouldn't regard mental health as a significant element in the support of young practitioners. And yet, mental health is a significant constraint because of the unique pressures that come with being a lawyer. And these pressures come from work. If you are a lawyer, you are expected to consume large volumes of material, most often under extreme time pressures. But also you are still expected to be helpful at home. You are still expected to play a contributing role in society. But you are only one person. And if you are young and ill-prepared for the demands of the profession, you could literally suffer a mental breakdown. And so we are unable to train lawyers only on account of creating the right work structure or creating the right income structure without a social and psychological support. So it's become central now in the light of the expanded obligations that law comes with income, but it also comes with psychosocial support.
Yeah, Absolutely. I think another factor that I want to then look at is the issue of quality education and perhaps the curriculum to date, the school of thoughts that are employed to prepare these young graduates in their capacity building. What are your thoughts of this? Is an overall needed? And I'm asking this because obviously learning involves the use of language, literacy and interpretation at large. And so, you know, we can't ignore the use of legal language, which I think has come to the fore recently during the Senzomiwa trial, amongst others, where, you know, you want to also look at how lawyers litigate, perhaps in multilingual courtrooms, to ensure that justice for majority of African language-speaking litigants, for example, are enforced and that their constitutional language rights are adhered to. What comes to mind on that point?
Yes. Firstly, do I think that there is a need for an overhaul? Definitely, there is a need for an overhaul. What we need is a rethink of the LLB structure in order to make it aligned with South Africa's post-constitutional demands. Certain fundamental causes, law of property, law of contract, law of delict, and criminal law, all need to be rethought in order to be aligned to the constitutional values and the constitutional system. Those four causes which are at the heart of the practice of law still reflect a residual colonial, in the sense of British legal system, with the Roman Dutch legal system. What is yet to be developed in those areas is how to align them with the ethos of the Constitution. And most judgments grapple with the alignment. And then the second area, apart from rebuilding the four key pillars of the legal profession and making them in tandem with the constitutional system, is rebuilding African values and African systems into the mainstream legal system. Although the Constitution puts the common law on par with customary law, the truth is that in the South African context, customary law is severely underdeveloped as a result of years of suppression, marginalization, and distortion. If common law is to be really on par with customary law needs to be redeveloped, rethought, and given teeth in order to play its meaningful role alongside the common law and alongside the constitutional system. And then the last area of curriculum reform is, what do the legal practitioners need to know in order to function in a modern day South Africa? Unlike in the past, legal practitioners now need to know basic economics. They need to know about finance. They need to know about mathematics. They need to know about science. And yet legal education still does not center the study and knowledge of finance, the study and knowledge of economics into the mainstream curricula. And the last part here is language. Language, language, language. It is crucial that lawyers are multilingual in order to function optimally in a multilingual society. Two languages have dominated the training and the practice of law for hundreds of years: Dutch, which later transformed into Afrikaans, and English. And indigenous languages have not been developed. This is a contradiction of the promise of the Constitution of multilingualism. And if there is to be an area of big institutional reforms, it is to make it compulsory for every LLB student to learn an African language, not Afrikaans, to learn Xhosa, to learn Zulu, to learn Tswana, to learn Sesotho, to learn Chibenda, to learn Tsonga, as a compulsory module before they can be awarded an LLB certificate. Otherwise, you create a divided legal profession where the majority of lawyers are simply unable to comprehend the languages spoken by their own clients. And in the courtroom, the dominance of English and Afrikaans should be attended to urgently. You are right about pointing to the Senzomiwa trial. I don't know what language the judge speaks, but from what I understand, he speaks Venda, and probably he knows a bit of Sepedi. And I don't know what languages the advocates speak. But what I can tell you is that everybody in that courtroom is Black. And yet the medium of communication is English. This for me is an oddity. It is a contradiction in terms that even where you have 100% black participation in a trial, the medium of communication remains English.
Sure, absolutely. And I think that's why that issue has now also come to the fore. But there's so many that I want, and so many points that I also want to get to. But in the interest of time, I'm going to have to wrap up this conversation. Perhaps in conclusion, looking at the issue of justice. And my question is justice impeded due to the rate of transformation within the legal system? Is there a need for complete overhaul of the bar structure at large? Does South Africa or the state of South Africa require us ultimately to relook and inform policy choices now more than ever? What does that future look like?
Yes, one of the major impediments to access to justice in South Africa is access to lawyers. We need more lawyers, contrary to popular belief, but we need more lawyers who are practicing human rights law, because many South Africans simply have no access to legal resources. Legal resources are very scarce in South Africa. In addition to being scarce, where they do become available, they are extremely expensive. It is not easy for an ordinary South African to have access to an attorney. If you add the cost of an advocate, if a case goes to the High Court, or goes on appeal to the Supreme Court of Appeal or to the Constitutional Court, the cost of litigation can double, sometimes triple, sometimes it could even quadruple. So legal services are extremely expensive, and that is why they are inaccessible. So we cannot talk meaningfully about access to justice unless we speak about access to lawyers. That is why one of the most tangible things that can be done to make legal services accessible is to make it compulsory for practitioners to perform community service as a requirement before they can be awarded their certificate. Even after they have been awarded their certificate of practice, it should be made compulsory that a minimum number of hours per annum should be devoted to pro bono services in order to make legal services accessible to all. And without that, our constitutional democratic project cannot realize its full potential if many ordinary South Africans have no access to lawyers.
Nkosi Majola, thank you very much for your time. I just obviously want to wrap up the conversation there because time has gotten to us. But Advocate Tembeka Ngugaitobi was chatting about eradicating barriers to entry in the profession for young lawyers. Again, highlighting some of the challenges and strides taken to date. Thank you once again for his time. Let's take a quick ad break and continue with more updates on the other side. We'll be right back. Right, welcome back. The week ahead continues with myself, Liesl Wilson, with a special focus on Youth Month as Youth Day approaches on the 16th of June, 2022. We've seen that South Africa has over 10 million young people aged between 15 and 24 years, and of these, only 2.5 million were in the labor force, either employed or unemployed. But the largest share of this group of young people are those that, of course, out on the labor force. To chat about some of the economic challenges that South African youth face, we're going to be joined by Ayabonga Cawe. He's an author and economist and a very own member of the SABC. Thank you so much for joining us here on the SABC once again.
Afternoon, Liesl, and afternoon to the viewers. Thank you so much for the invite.
All right, we obviously looking at the strides that have been taken, to date, particularly amongst the youth, which form the majority of South Africa and the continent, particularly as we head into 2050. What do you mean by economic participation by young people when we begin to imagine these conversations and implementation at large?
Well, look, I think at a conceptual level, what we're really talking about are the opportunities to access earning and learning opportunities that can support livelihoods of the young people themselves and those around them. And so in a sense, it's, the ability to participate in activities that can contribute to your own upkeep and your own reproduction And so it's not just only about jobs. And I think, one of the biggest challenges we've got in South Africa is that outside of the labor market, if one can't participate there are very few other alternative livelihood opportunities that one could undertake in order to be able to eat, in order to be able to still survive, and be able to contribute to the survival of those around them.
Yeah, absolutely. And perhaps closely linked with skills development is the burning issue of unemployment. South Africa's rate of unemployment is associated with a range of social ills, including poverty, inequality, which eventually also leads to crime. Why do we have a job crisis, especially amongst the youth and the able?
Look, I don't think that it has anything to do with young people per se, or that there are any unique attributes that young people would have that predispose them to being more unemployable than maybe a few other categories, in our society. I think there are two potentially related issues. The first one is the structure of the South African economy, which has historically been, I guess, one dominated by what a lot of people refer to as the minerals energy complex. And in the post-apartheid period, a lot of the sectors that have really driven the charge insofar as, production, employment, and so on are concerned, are also confronted now with their own structural and technical changes that mean it becomes a lot more difficult for them to unlock their capacity to employ people for every additional unit of production or additional rand invested. And I think a big part of this, we tend to see, in sectors like the services sector, the banking sector, and increasingly in a labor-intensive sector like, wholesale, retail, and trade, where effectively the advance of those sectors and the conditions through which they are able to create a profit, which is why a lot of them would undertake business in the first place, no longer requires as much by way of, warm bodies or employed people. I think the other related challenge is that we've got a low share of national output, or what is produced by the society, of sectors that traditionally are able to employ people at scale. And that is manufacturing, if you unpack it a bit more, clothing, textiles, furniture, and by extension also construction, which I think also shows how sad, what many people are calling the investment strike of the private sector. But we also tend to see over the last few years or so, I guess, particular withdrawal by the public sector from new greenfield construction spend that can create the jobs, which has relatively lower barriers to entry than, say, high skill or high complexity service jobs. And so in a sense, we know which sectors are able to yield the employment we need at scale. And yet it sometimes seems that the investment into those sectors is not being attracted on a scale that is necessary to get people into work.
Well, speaking of which, because obviously we have to then look at the implications of not broadening participation by young people in the economy. In your book, you write about securing the base first, the home, and then securing our future.
Well, a big part of, certainly what we've seen in South Africa. So if I go back to the sectors that traditionally have, a proven track record of being able for every additional, ounce of output or every additional rand invested to create more jobs relative to others. It's construction, it's clothing, it's furniture, it's tourism, it's all of these sectors where for every advance in fixed investment or expansion in production needs, they are able to create more employment. And these sectors also tend to be the sectors, to your point, Lizo, that also meet basic needs. Yeah. So that are able, if channeled correctly, to unlock, investment from community scale right through to, commercial scale investments in agriculture, that are able, via construction, to be able to meet people's not only economic infrastructure needs, but also social infrastructure needs. And we see it across all of our, districts in South Africa, that it's quite clear that if we were to invest properly into these sectors that have a proven track record of not just only meeting social needs, but also having strong linkages with other upstream sectors. Take construction. For every new project, you are injecting something into the demand for steel, cement, glass, aluminium, and all manner of things that go into building, any project. And it just seems that a lot of these things require us maybe to go back to that. So how do we secure the primordial needs of people to eat, to be housed accordingly, to be clothed? Because those are the sectors: clothing, textile, furniture, construction, both for commercial and even, I guess, residential needs, are the kind of jobs that, are the kind of sectors that not only just create the jobs, but also are able to deal with the massive backlogs that we have. Significant numbers of people still using the bucket system, schools without infrastructure, dilapidating infrastructure, and seemingly irreversible social decline in many of our cities and secondary towns. And all of these things, it sometimes just seems that part of the solution is also in confronting the problem.
Absolutely, Ayabonga. And, we look at the policies that we have pursued, and we have to ask why these have failed. I'm asking this also because socioeconomic inequality and inadequate education systems are also some of those contributing factors that drive such high unemployment rates that in reality disproportionately affect black youth. And the issue of sex and gender also then comes to the fore. And you also write about this when you look at cycles of perpetuating serial injustice. I think it's on page 195 as well.
Yeah, look, Lisa, I think for one of the saddest things about South Africa is that all of the people who are able-bodied at the greatest potential of their lives, for structural and other reasons, not of their own doing in many instances, are closed out of the labor market. Looking for a job in this country is a job, largely because of the spatial form of many of our cities and many of our towns, which 9 times out of 10 always mean people aren't necessarily living close to where it is that they work, unless you're fortunate enough, with how property markets function and how, housing is priced in South Africa. In all likelihood, you're part of the sprawl of people who have to spend inordinate amounts of money as a proportion of what they earn on things like transport, on things like, going out, and small things like printing, for instance. And so, in a sense, you see this translating in the numbers of young people who are disengaging from even the job search. And we saw this not just, around the COVID-19 moment, but even before COVID-19, where large proportions of young people are opting out of the job search. And you see this in the number of discouraged work seekers. Of course, I think the other reality that we can't avoid is that many of these labor-intensive sectors I'm talking about also have, a considerable number of people who would be defined as working poor. So who are in a job, but fundamentally what it is that they earn, and if one considers all of the obligations on them, effectively are still poor, even though they are working. And so in a sense, it's difficult in South Africa to say, by getting a job, by extension, you're out of, the categorization of poverty across many, many different measures.
Yeah, well, there's, speaking of which, I then also want to look at the digital divide that's come to the fore. This is the world perhaps migrates during this fourth industrial revolution. Many businesses adopting that digital approach. And I wonder, as we perhaps look at solutions going forward, what kind of support do you think that the youth could be offered, especially those who are in rural and underdeveloped areas, perhaps to ensure that they are not left behind? We don't perpetuate a modern form of slavery.
Look, well, a big part of what we have to do is to take lessons from what we've done before. If one looks at the transmission network and the number of households connected just on Eskom, now, of course, there's massive challenges at the moment, with load shedding and so on. But if you look at the early 90s and how many households were on the grid, and you compare that to where we were, say, at around 2010, you can't but, laud the remarkable achievement of connecting so many people who did not have electricity before. And I think we need to learn lessons from that, especially as we talk about, the migration now from analog to digital, which might unlock a lot of spectrum, which in function might work better in sparsely populated areas that don't have, reliable internet connection. And a big part of this is important because a lot of work at the moment is emerging in the digital realm, micro work and so on. And even if you think about global business services, so particular forms of service employment are gravitating to being done on digital platforms. And so in a sense, there is a requirement to make sure that that doesn't become a further flashpoint of inequality or a further flashpoint of social tension and division in our society, as we saw. If one compares the learning outcomes of schools that were able, during the hard lockdown, to be able to continue via digital means, and those schools may be in, the former homeland areas in South Africa, what I call in the book the Native Reserve, who effectively had the educational project disrupted in very particular ways because of a lack of underlying infrastructure. If lawmakers have challenges. Members of parliament, members of provincial legislatures, we see it all the time. Patchy, unreliable connection in many of the places where they come from or when they've gone out to go to their constituents. Then how much more for people who are, in communities where even the investment in electricity is a recent phenomenon. And so we've got quite a bit to do in making sure that that doesn't become an area that widens the chasm of inequality, social tension, and social divisions in our society.
Bonga, we're running out of time. I think just in conclusion, based on everything you've just echoed, I wonder, as we commemorate, look at the strides taken and some of the challenges faced by the youth, what gives you hope about the future labor force of this country?
Well, look, I think if there's anything we draw as this generation of young people, if there should be anything we draw from the experience of 1976, is that 1976 is a particular moment in a long, a relay of political and economic struggle that still continues to this day. And I think the reality is that, if there's any message that we need to take on as young people is to say, how do we best equip ourselves and tool ourselves in order to be able to continue many of those unfinished tasks? And a big part of that in this current moment is how do we get many of our peers who have effectively been ejected from any meaningful material and economic participation into participation, even in instances where that doesn't look like a typical job and what we might have deemed a job, in the 20th century. And a big part of this is going to require us to think differently about how do we get people into gainful work? How do we position the state as an employer of last resort and as a pathway to earning and learning opportunities for those who might have given up the job search? So that's our task. It's not an easy one, but
Aluta continua. Thank you very much for your time today. Bonga Kawe, economist rather than author, chatting to us about some of the challenges that South African youth experienced to date, 28 years into democracy. Perhaps more questions than answers at this point, but we'll see how implementation occurs from here into as we navigate the future labor force of this country. Let's take a quick ad break and continue with more updates on the other side. All right, welcome back. The week ahead continues now. Following the enactment of menstrual leave in several countries, some female activists say that South African lawmakers should be following suit. Currently, workers who work 5 days per week are entitled to 30 days leave every 36 months. However, women feel that period leave should also be considered for the female workforce.
For many women, their menstrual cycle is a painful experience. Termed dysmenorrhea, some women have to be confined to their beds due to the extremity of the pain. In the last couple of years, countries such as Indonesia, Zambia, Taiwan and South Korea have legislated laws that enable female workers to take paid or unpaid leave to deal with the condition. With Spain being the latest country to join in offering their female workers time off for the condition, local women say that government should also consider giving women time off when going through a painful menstrual cycle.
Women's rights are not really focused upon, just generally all over the world. I think people are more focused on, because I guess men do the laws, so they don't consider us. A period law is something that's very functional. I know a lot of women who struggle during their period. It could be anything from 3 days to 7 days, and it's excruciating pain. You're throwing up, you can't go to work, but because our law doesn't accommodate for that, you have to show up, drag yourself and push through. Like right now it's winter. If it gets really, really cold, all women know your periods, they don't like the cold.
She says, when some people go on their periods, they're in a lot of pain and they wish to sleep. And if you're at work, you're unable to do these things.
You're right, it's not a waste of time.
It's good, it's not a bad thing. We all experience periods differently. Other people need period leave. This view supported by menstruation advocates such as Candice Chira, popularly known as the Minister of Periods. Chira says that employers should not have to wait on government to introduce time off, but should be proactive in advancing the needs of their female workforce.
More than anything, it should allow for companies to recognize the fact that endometriosis, which is a period pain condition which affects 1 in 3 women, and probably even more because there's not a lot of research in terms of endometriosis in South Africa, should allow them the ability to say, you know, take 1 or 2 days off for that week that you're menstruating, but still be able to work, instead of forcing someone to work in an environment that really just isn't conducive for them.
The Department of Public Service and Administration says that it's currently unable to comment on the issue.
The Department of Public Service and Administration is unable to comment on this matter at this point.
While government mules over the matter, millions of women remain hopeful that lawmakers will heed their plight. Mahlako Koman, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Following news further afield, in 2013, the United Nations Human Rights Council adopted a resolution for the prevention of attacks and discrimination against persons with albinism. The date set for the International Albinism Awareness Day annually is the 13th of June, and the theme for this year is United in Making Our Voices Heard. Perhaps joining us for more on this is Nomasonto Mazibuko. She's the Commissioner at the Commission for Gender and Equality and is also the founder of Albinism Society of South Africa. Well, a very good afternoon to you, and thank you for making time to join us here on the SABC.
Good afternoon, Lizelle, and good afternoon to the viewers.
Now, Masonto, let's get into the, some of the issues to date. Since the inception date to mark this, I mean, what has been some of the more outstanding milestones within the community of people living with albinism, especially in South Africa, before we get to some of the challenges?
Firstly, Lizelle, thank you very much for inviting me to this interview. We are people with albinism. We don't live with albinism. The milestone is that we are continuously getting the language correctly, though we are not very moving forward, especially in our African languages, where we find in English it is the doctor and patient relationship where people are said to be people with albinism. But in our African languages, we still find people using derogatory name to say people with albinism, Inkau, Ishaiwa, and then in the Tswana group, language group, they say Kileswafe, and where we find Li is a very derogatory, where you use it Li to animals. And we are saying we have seen young people going through and gaining confidence into the space in employment, in the space of the arts. We find that most of the time, people with albinism are now going out. Families are no longer hiding their children with albinism. Families now are eager to say, my child has albinism. These are the issues that the child has to be acquainted to, which is to use sunscreen every 4 hours, to have her head every time when she goes out, and to give more people the confidence to say, yes, I've got albinism. These are the limitations that I have.
Well, Nomasonto, thank you for that. And I think this is why these conversations are so important, because we have to get the use of language and the narratives to manage the perceptions around it. And I want to thank you for that as well, because as we look at the theme for this year, which is United in Making Our Voices Heard, does this suggest that the community of people with albinism, and their voices, are they not heard enough? If so, why?
Because people believe in working in silos, and people believe in staying on their own lanes, because they say, I'm better because I've got a family support. I'm better. I go to certain schools where our parents could afford, where there are a number of children in a class. But we're saying, as people with albinism who find yourself that now you are elevated, pick up the next person. Let's talk in one voice. Let's support one another. Look at the arts. People are there and they are making their way. But there are still other people in the rural areas who are still suffering, who don't have sunscreen, So when we say we speak in one voice, you are going to adopt a person with albinism. We started mentoring each other as persons with albinism. We are united now as the people, different organizations. We had Albinism Society of South Africa, then other organizations came up. So in the one voice, we say united in our voices. Where you are, why don't you brighten the corner where you are? But a person with albinism should uplift the next one. The organizations must come up and speak in one voice in South Africa to say, we are people with albinism. Albinism is a manageable condition. Teachers, parents, neighbors, priests, please treat us with dignity, because we don't want to see other people now spitting in their chest because they are saying people with albinism, touch wood, they are a curse. We're not a curse. We are as a blessing as in any child, in any family.
Absolutely, Nomasonto. Dignity and justice is important. And, you know, we're obviously alluding to the issues of the politics of recognition at large and access to resources, which, as you now highlighted, has become one of the pressing issues. I wonder, with some of the myths and some of the stigmas associated with, with people with albinism, what more should be done at this point? I'm asking this because obviously we've seen the rise of mental issues coming to the fore, and some of the psychosocial issues that exacerbate, when the way they are treated as we're speaking. How do we begin to also tackle that?
Well, Lizelle, we're tackling it. The first one to say, we don't die, we disappear. As long as you are human, you will die at some stage. There is no colony or a mountain where people with albinism disappear to. Secondly, our HIV status. People think when they have sexual intercourse with children under the age of 10, they will have their HIV status being cured. Number 3, our mental intelligence differ according to our genetics. If you are a person who gets 90s and we are intelligent, it's because of your DNA. And we're saying people with albinism also can make families. We are people at the end of the day, and we do bear children. And those people who still want to give women with albinism children and leave them single-handedly, those women with albinism, they also will raise their children to reach higher heights. Those are the ills, social ills, where they find that people still say derogatory words. People still feel when they look at you, maybe in a queue of a supermarket, they don't look at you once, and they keep on comparing. Hey, this one is better than the other. Look at the makeup on her. Look at the style that this person have. And we are saying, as persons with albinism, united we stand. We are speaking in one voice. Give us a change. People with albinism are people too.
Nomasonto, I want to thank you very much for your time today and for being part of this discussion. As we heard, the date set for International Albinism Awareness Day is occurring annually on the 13th of June, and the theme for this year is United in Making Our Voices Heard. Again, a very big thank you to Nomasonto Mazibuko for her contribution to this discussion. Let's take a quick ad break and continue with more news on the other side. Right, welcome back. We continue with the week ahead. In other news, one person has died in a fire that gutted an informal settlement at Guamaima in Johannesburg in the early hours of this morning. Another person was injured and transported to hospital by emergency services, where earlier SABC news reporter Ulemo Waone Mutoa spoke to the residents there.
Past 11. Kwaqala ngale nzansi bokusha khona kushise omunye usisi bekalayithe istove emodeni edakiwe waya ngale ekhaya elisha kominye imkhukhu wayobatshela ukuthi ngale kuyasha mara thina zange sitshele because kube sibone elukube sikhonile ukuthi siucishe
nina nikhone ukuthi nithathe ini from your place
yimpahla sikhona ukuyithatha kodwa wardrobe amafridge amakhabethe indishi zokugeza sikhona ukuyithatha even nokudla sikhona ukukuthatha neshebo nje okuningi sikhona ukuthatha nezicathula zasenzansi phansi
ninesikhathi esingakini ihleli la
5 years
ngisho ukuthi since the fire
sihlale sukela past 12 ngoba sekuba up until now ngoba past 10 manje.
Okay, let's hear from the other person. Puti ngiyakubona uhlalelo umlilo la wena ungasichazela nje ukuthi uzweni uboneni.
Cha ngizwe nje past 12 bathi kuyasha phandle mangibona ngiphuma phandle ngibona umlilo kuyavutha nje la esihlala khona ngaphuma uma ngaphuma nesikhwama kuphela into zami zishe zonke anginakho ukudla anginanto yakupheka anginalutho nje yabo yilo nto nje ngiyibonile nje ebusuku kuze kube manje uba ngihlila emlilweni la yabo angazi ukuthi ngizophuma ngishoneke
into enje iyavela before or iyaqala
evelile umlilo nje mina ngiphuma phandle ngawubona okwesibili angazi ngiyacabanga ukuthi okwesibili okwesibili kwenzeka lokho.
Right, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll be back next week for a look at the weekend review as our role ensuring country duty is enforced happens here on the SABC. But for myself, Hazel Wilson, and the rest of the team, until next time, it's goodbye for now. Thank you very much for tuning in.